The movie starts inside a diner where a horrifying massacre has just taken place. Bodies are scattered everywhere, blood covers the floor, and the place looks like a complete slaughterhouse. A terrified man calls 911 and tells the operator that his friend Nancy is dying. When asked for his name, he says he's Jake Collins. But what exactly happened here? For that, we have to go back 24 hours earlier. Nancy is sitting alone in a field when she takes a pregnancy test. The result is positive, and while most people would probably panic, Nancy seems surprisingly calm. The bigger problem is that she doesn't even know who the father is. Later, she meets her best friend Tabitha and tells her the news. Tabitha immediately asks who the father is, but Nancy admits she has no idea. She's been with multiple guys recently, and honestly, she doesn't even care who the father is. Nancy has already decided that she'll probably get rid of the baby. After all, if her father finds out she's pregnant, she's convinced he'll kill her before she even gets the chance to have the baby. Nancy then heads to work at her father's diner. She used to work there as a waitress, but after her mother's death, she's become increasingly careless. Unfortunately, she's already running late. And things get worse when her old car suddenly breaks down on the way. With no idea how to fix it, Nancy leaves the car behind and starts walking toward the diner. Luckily, she soon runs into Bobby, one of her co-workers. Bobby clearly likes Nancy and doesn't hide it, but Nancy doesn't seem interested in him. Still, when he sees her walking to work, he offers her a ride on his bicycle. Nancy accepts, and the two eventually reach the diner. The moment she arrives, Edward is waiting for her. He isn't happy that she's late and reminds her that she's the manager now, so she needs to start acting responsibly. But then Edward gives her even more bad news. He's going out on a date tonight, which means Nancy will have to handle the late shift. And she'll be stuck there all night with Jake, the diner's cook. Nancy immediately complains. She thinks Jake is a complete weirdo and asks her father to let Bobby stay instead. But Edward refuses. He says he can't afford to pay Bobby overtime and insists that Jake is his most trusted employee. Nancy has no choice. Later, she tells Bobby about the late shift, and Bobby immediately offers to stay anyway, even without getting paid. It's pretty obvious that he's doing it because he wants to spend the night with Nancy. But Nancy isn't interested. While the diner gets busier, Nancy suddenly starts feeling sick. She rushes to the back and begins throwing up. Jake notices her and quickly figures out what's going on. He asks if she's pregnant. Before Nancy can answer, Edward suddenly appears and demands to know why she's sick. Nancy freezes. Luckily, Jake thinks fast. He points toward some rotten meat that had been left in the kitchen and tells Edward that the smell must have made Nancy vomit. Edward buys the explanation. Nancy's secret is safe, for now. Edward then heads off for his date, completely unaware of what is waiting for everyone at the diner. In the afternoon, one of the staff members, Pete, accidentally spills water on the floor. He immediately apologizes, but Nancy tells him not to worry about it. Then she notices a group of troublesome teenagers outside the diner. They're riding around on mopeds and causing a scene. Nancy goes outside to confront them. But instead of listening, the boys start insulting her. Things get even worse when one of them throws a dead animal at her. Nancy loses her patience and orders them to leave. She then walks back inside but almost slips on the same wet floor. Seeing that Pete still hasn't cleaned it, she angrily scolds him for being so careless. Pete apologizes again, but Jake quickly steps in and tells Nancy to leave his brother alone. He explains that Pete has Down syndrome and doesn't always work like everyone else. Before Nancy can respond, the situation gets even stranger. The teenagers suddenly walk into the diner wearing creepy masks. Nancy immediately tells them to get out, but they refuse. Instead, they demand to be served and even place the dead animal on one of the tables. At this point, Nancy decides to call the police. She picks up the phone and pretends to report the teenagers. But Jake quickly realizes something is wrong. The call isn't even connected. Nancy is only bluffing. Still, the teenagers don't want to risk getting caught, so they finally leave. But before walking away, one of them looks at Nancy and warns her that he'll be back later. Once they're gone, Nancy gathers everyone working at the diner. Bobby, Pete, Jake, Coop, and the other employees all stand around as Nancy reminds them that she's the manager now. She may be younger than them, but they still have to respect her decisions. Jake, however, isn't impressed. He tells Nancy that the only reason she's the manager is because her father owns the diner. That comment hits a nerve. Nancy immediately fires him. Jake is shocked and argues that she can't just fire him like that. But Nancy refuses to listen and orders him to leave. With no other choice, Jake walks out. Now that Jake is gone, Bobby starts checking on Nancy again. He asks if she's okay and even offers to stay for the late night shift with her. But instead of appreciating his concern, Nancy gets irritated. She tells Bobby that he's a good guy, but he needs to understand that the two of them are never going to happen. And then, in front of everyone in the diner, she harshly tells him to back off. As evening arrives, the day shift finally ends and all the employees start heading home. Nancy says goodbye to Bobby, but he's still hurt by the way she treated him earlier. Soon, darkness falls, leaving Nancy completely alone in the diner. She calls her father and tells him that she fired Jake because of his attitude. Edward isn't happy about it and tells her he'll deal with Jake tomorrow. With nobody else around, Nancy finally decides to enjoy herself. She turns up the music, switches on the disco lights, and starts dancing around the empty diner like she's at a party. But she has no idea that someone is watching her from outside. A little later, Nancy suddenly feels sick again and throws up, making a huge mess on the floor. While she's cleaning it up, she suddenly hears loud banging coming from the walls. Nancy stops. The same masked teenagers from earlier are back. She grabs the speaker and warns them to leave, once again threatening to call the police. But this time the teenagers aren't scared. They keep banging on the diner and start trying to get inside. Nancy's confidence disappears. She quickly locks the doors and calls 911 for real. She frantically explains that a group of masked teenagers is attacking the diner. But the operator gives her terrible news. All the nearby units are busy, and they'll send someone as soon as they can. Nancy isn't happy with that answer. Then suddenly the call disconnects. Now she's completely on her own. The teenagers become even more aggressive and start trying to force their way inside. Nancy grabs a knife to protect herself and desperately looks for somewhere to hide. But things get even worse when she comes across the dead animal carcass from earlier. Then the electricity suddenly goes out. The entire diner falls into darkness. Nancy starts panicking. She desperately searches through her bag for her phone, but she can't find it. And just when she thinks someone is approaching her from behind, she hears police sirens outside. Nancy quickly lets the sheriff inside and tells him everything. She explains that the teenagers were terrorizing her and somehow even cut the electricity. But when the sheriff flips the switch, the lights suddenly come back on. He searches the diner and checks the surrounding area, but there's no sign of the teenagers anywhere. The sheriff then calls the station and reports that some kids were causing trouble at the diner but ran away when he arrived. Still, he decides to stay for a while and keep Nancy safe. Nancy serves the sheriff a cup of coffee, but she's clearly annoyed by his relaxed attitude and the way he keeps staring at her. She again explains what happened, telling him that the teenagers came on mopeds and kept banging on the diner windows. The moment the sheriff hears the word mopeds, his attitude completely changes. He immediately takes Nancy outside and puts her inside his police car. Then he reveals something terrifying. Before coming to the diner, he had arrived at the scene of one of the most brutal massacres he'd ever seen. And according to witnesses, the suspects were seen escaping the area on mopeds. Nancy suddenly realizes that the teenagers outside weren't just messing around. They're killers. And then, bang, the sheriff is suddenly attacked. Nancy jumps out of the car and runs back inside the diner. She locks herself inside the storage room and hides. From there, she watches in horror as one of the masked teenagers brutally beats the sheriff. Then Nancy notices another masked figure standing outside the window. She barely manages to breathe. But just when she thinks she's completely alone, someone familiar appears outside. It's Bobby. Nancy quickly rushes over, pulls him inside and tells him what's happening. She grabs his phone and immediately tries calling her father. But Edward doesn't answer. Before they can figure out what to do next, the attackers suddenly enter the diner. Nancy and Bobby quickly hide inside the kitchen. But Bobby accidentally makes a noise. The attackers hear it. Bobby takes off running, forcing Nancy to hide again. With Bobby's phone still in her hand, Nancy quickly sends a message to Tabitha, begging her to come to the diner immediately. But before she can do anything else, one of the masked men finds her. And things get even worse. They've already captured Bobby. The attackers tie both Nancy and Bobby's hands with duct tape and then force them to kiss each other. Nancy refuses to cooperate. So one of the masked men drags her into the back room to punish her. He starts sniffing her like some kind of maniac. But Nancy notices an opportunity. She manages to free herself, grabs a knife and stabs him. Then she runs for her life. Outside the diner, another masked figure suddenly appears. Nancy doesn't hesitate. She stabs him directly in the stomach. But then she realizes something horrifying. The person she just stabbed is Pete. Nancy is completely stunned. The other masked attackers, including Bobby, immediately rush outside to help him. Then one of them removes his mask. It's Coop. Nancy finally understands the truth. The people terrorizing her aren't random teenagers. They're her own co-workers. And now the movie takes us back to the moment everything started falling apart. Right after Nancy fired Jake, he desperately begged her to reconsider. He explains that he has bills to pay and needs money for his medical prescriptions. But Nancy doesn't care. She tells him that he should have thought about all of that before insulting her. Jake is furious, but there's nothing he can do. He leaves the diner and gets into his car, completely broken. Things get even worse when he tries to refill his prescriptions but discovers that he hasn't paid his bills for 3 months. He calls several relatives and asks them for money. But nobody is willing to help him. Later, after Pete's shift ends, he and Jake head home. On the way, they stop at a drug dealer's place. The dealer refuses to give Jake anything without payment. Jake then pulls out a gun and forces him to hand over the drugs. As they drive home, Jake gets high and starts opening up to Pete. He says the drugs help him deal with the trauma he's carried throughout his life. Jake also reveals that he had big plans for the diner and was about to discuss them with Edward. But now all of that is gone. And Jake can't believe Nancy had the nerve to throw him out so easily. Not long after, Jake spots the same group of troublesome teenagers gathered around a bonfire. He immediately tells Pete to stop the car. The brothers walk over and the teenagers recognize them from the diner. Jake casually tells them that he doesn't work there anymore. But the conversation quickly takes a dark turn. Jake starts blaming the teenagers for getting him fired. One of the boys gets aggressive and moves toward him. Jake suddenly stabs him in the stomach. The others freeze. Jake then pulls out a gun and orders all of them to get on their knees. He hands the weapon to Pete and tells him to shoot anyone who tries to move. Then Jake turns on some loud country music. And what happens next is completely insane. He forces the teenagers to dance. They refuse and start arguing, so Jake tells Pete to shoot one of them. Pete can't do it. Jake grabs the gun and pulls the trigger himself. But there's no bullet left. Furious, Jake attacks the boy with his bare hands and eventually chokes him to death. Afterward, Pete sits in the car crying. Instead of comforting his brother, Jake blames him for what happened and tells him to stop acting weak. Then Jake kicks Pete out of the car, gives him a mask and orders him to wait for him at the diner. Meanwhile, Coop and Bobby are drinking together. Bobby starts talking about Nancy and admits that he genuinely has feelings for her. That's when Jake suddenly appears wearing one of the creepy masks and scares them. He then shows them the mopeds. When they ask where he got them, Jake casually explains that he and Pete stole them from the teenagers. Soon the group heads toward the diner. Pete gets there first and notices Nancy talking to her father on the phone. Meanwhile, Jake gives the creepy masks to Coop and Bobby. He has an idea. The 3 masked men then surround the diner and begin banging on the windows and walls. Nancy is terrified. When they see her calling the police, Bobby starts feeling guilty. He suggests that they stop because Nancy looks genuinely scared. But Jake refuses. He insists that Nancy is just pretending again. Then he cuts the electricity, making the situation even more terrifying. When the sheriff finally arrives, the group quickly hides inside the storage room. Jake then gives Coop and Pete another job. They take one of the mopeds around to the other side of the diner and wait for his signal. Outside, the sheriff is trying to calm Nancy down and get her into his car. Then Jake gives the signal. The moped suddenly roars to life. The noise distracts the sheriff. And Jake uses that moment to attack him. Nancy immediately runs away and hides. Meanwhile, Jake repeatedly beats the sheriff until the officer is finally dead. After seeing the sheriff get killed, Bobby finally realizes things have gone way too far. He takes off his mask and pretends that he has just arrived on his bicycle. Nancy sees him and quickly brings him inside, thinking he's there to help. Meanwhile, Coop is completely shaken. He can't believe they just killed a cop. But Jake has no sympathy. He tells Coop that he did it for him because Coop's fingerprints are all over the diner. If the police find them, they'll all end up in prison. So Jake gives Coop an ultimatum. Find Nancy and Bobby and kill them. Otherwise they're all going to jail. Back in the diner, Nancy is still struggling to understand why her own employees are doing this to her. While the others are busy treating Pete's injuries, Nancy quietly slips away. Then she notices something familiar in the trash. It's the rotten meat from earlier that morning. Meanwhile, Jake orders Coop to find Nancy before she can escape. If he wants to stay out of prison, he has to finish the job. But Bobby suddenly notices the sheriff's car keys sitting on the counter. He grabs them and attacks Jake. For a moment, it looks like Bobby might actually get the upper hand. Elsewhere, Edward leaves a voicemail for Jake. He says he's heard about what happened and tells Jake not to take Nancy's behavior personally. He even assures him that Jake will always have a job at the diner. Jake never gets to hear the message. Back inside, Coop finally finds Nancy hiding in the kitchen. He attacks her, but Nancy fights back. She manages to shove him toward the deep fryer and then knocks him unconscious. Believing she's finally escaped, Nancy runs away. But Jake has already overpowered Bobby. He brutally stabs him and leaves him bleeding on the floor. Jake then enters the kitchen and tries to wake Coop. But Coop is already dead. Nancy soon finds Bobby lying in a pool of blood. He's barely alive, but with the little strength he has left, he tries to hand Nancy the car keys. Then, suddenly, Tabitha arrives. She walks into the diner and sees the horrifying scene. Bodies, blood, and destruction are everywhere. Terrified, she immediately turns around and runs away. Nancy uses the distraction to escape downstairs. But Jake follows her. He reaches the office and looks around. Nancy is nowhere to be found. Then suddenly, a scream. Nancy tries to make her way out of the diner, but Jake appears again. Before she can react, he stabs her in the back. By now it's already morning. Jake drags Nancy back inside and repeatedly strikes her in the stomach. Then, as if to add one final insult, he places a sticker badge on her. Afterward, Jake gets into his car and drives away. While on the road, he calls the police and reports the massacre at the diner. Back at the diner, we get one final surprise. Nancy is still alive. She slowly pulls the knife out of her back, revealing how she managed to survive. Earlier, she had wrapped the rotten meat around her body before Jake attacked her. The disgusting meat had actually worked as a kind of protective layer, weakening the impact of the stabbing. But Nancy is still badly injured. She crawls over to Bobby's body and quietly grieves for him. Then she spots the sheriff's car keys. Nancy grabs them, gets into the car, and drives away as fast as she can. Meanwhile, Jake returns home. He starts calling out for Pete, even though he already knows his brother isn't there. Realizing that the police could soon come after him, Jake decides to leave town. He starts packing his clothes and preparing to disappear. But he has no idea that Nancy is already coming for him. She arrives outside his house, barely able to stand but still holding a knife. Jake suddenly hears the doorbell. He grabs a hammer and carefully approaches the door. When he opens it, nobody is there. The bell rings again. Jake looks around, confused. Then he notices something hanging from the door. It's Nancy's badge. Before he can react, Nancy attacks. She had secretly entered through the back door. Nancy brutally stabs Jake in the neck. Jake falls to the floor, bleeding heavily, while Nancy pulls the knife out and leaves him there to die. But Nancy has almost nothing left in her. She tries to keep walking, but her body finally gives up. She collapses beside the road. As she lies there, she remembers her conversation with Tabitha. Nancy admits that even though she's only 20, she already feels completely trapped in life. She had dreams and plans for her future, but now she's pregnant and doesn't even know what she wants anymore. Then, in the final moments, someone finally finds her. It's Edward, her father. He rushes to his injured daughter and assures her that help is coming. Nancy tries to speak, but she's too weak. After everything she's been through, she can only whisper 2 words. My baby. And with that, the movie comes to an end. Thanks for watching.